Well, Gabe, a lot there. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, Christine, I was actually at what we call a gaggle out on the South Lawn as the president was departing for Texas just a few minutes ago. It continues for a little bit longer. Just the camera angle is difficult with so many reporters there. Very interesting. In addition to what you just heard, he did comment on some other topics. I'll tick through them. First of all, the headline on Iran, certainly him saying that this is that he is not thrilled with how the negotiations has progressed, but seemed to say that he has not yet made a decision on what to do with Iran. He was asked about the military capabilities in the region, and he also said that it'd be nice if they could come to some sort of an agreement without using military force. Further on, I was hearing some other questions I was asked that are just playing out now. He also said that Iran is yet to say what he calls, quote, the magic words, which is that they will not develop a nuclear weapon. So that's on Iran. You also heard those noteworthy comments to my question about Cuba. I asked him whether he had any information on that boat that was involved in that deadly confrontation just off the coast of Cuba, where 4 people on board the boat were killed, 6 others injured, according to the Cuban government. There were several American citizens on the boat as well. At least one of them was killed. I asked him, did he believe the Cuban government's version of events? And you heard him right there. He said that it might be possible that there might be a, quote, friendly takeover of Cuba, certainly ramping up the rhetoric against Cuba's government. He also, at the beginning of those comments, talked about how he didn't like to see former President Bill Clinton deposed right now in Chappaqua, New York. But certainly a wide-ranging list of questions there, and the president stopping to take them right before he departed the White House. Christine.
Yeah, on Bill Clinton, he said, I like him. I don't like seeing him deposed. I think a lot of people focusing in on those Cuba comments, though, interesting. He said Marco Rubio seems to be taking, the Secretary of State seems to be taking the lead on this. He said there are many Americans who have fled Cuba who want to go back. These are pretty pointed comments about a friendly takeover. He said that phrase several times.
That's right. Well, he clearly came prepared to say that, Christine. I asked him the question. If you noticed, he did not directly ask or answer my question about the portion of did he trust the Cuban government when it came to the boat that had been involved in that alleged gunfight. He didn't comment on that, and really the White House has been notably silent on the details of that over the past 48 hours since this happened. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the people on that boat, whether we have 2 sources close to one of them who say that they were affiliated with an anti-Castro group that was opposed to Cuba's communist regime, but the Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that the U.S. is still gathering facts. Now, the Cuban government yesterday said that they are communicating with the U.S. and are willing to share information. But notably, the president right there did not speak about the boat, but he spoke in kind of more broadly that he would like to see a, quote, friendly takeover of Cuba. That is further than he has said before. Previously, the president had said that he believed that Cuba was a failing nation, a failing state, which he repeated there. But he seemed to imply previously that he thought that because of the fuel shortages, because of the economic sanctions, because of the embargo, and also because of the capture of Venezuela's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro, and stopping virtually all oil shipments to Cuba, that the nation would fall on its own. Now, escalating that rhetoric, saying that the U.S. could be involved in some sort of, quote, friendly takeover of the island. And going back to the history of Cuba, he's saying that he's been hearing about the island since he was much younger. Of course, the history of distrust between the U.S. and Cuba goes back decades, certainly to the Castro Revolution back in 1959. So a lot to take in there again from those questions, that gaggle, that exchange with reporters, and certainly news made on several fronts, Christine.
Yeah, and on Iran, I just want to circle back there because there has been a notable massing of U.S. military might in the region in recent weeks, and the president seems to me like he's clearly frustrated with the pace of negotiations here.
Yeah, certainly. Look, there were these critical talks in Geneva yesterday. We haven't gotten a whole lot of details from the White House on exactly how those went. And you heard the president there say that he wasn't thrilled with the pace with those negotiations. But from all indications, we have been hearing that the president has been presented options over the last several weeks when it comes to Iran. But the question is, will he make any sort of calculation that he does want to use military force on Iran? Certainly, there are a lot of, there's a lot of things to consider there, a lot of ways that things could go. But the United States has been amassing quite a large military presence in the Middle East over the last several weeks in preparation for this. And of course, there's also American personnel in Israel that have been told that if they want to leave the embassy there, to leave now, certainly raising concerns about what could be next year. But from our reporting, and from what you heard the president say there, he has not yet made a final decision on what to do with Iran. But that is certainly something that the White House is watching very closely. And he's saying that these negotiations will continue, Christine.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.